The Christian Science Churches of Southern California present this inspirational lecture series. Our community lectures feature speakers from around the world. They are Christian Science practitioners and teachers who devote their lives to praying with others and empowering people to pray effectively for themselves and the world. There are spiritual solutions to all of life's challenges. For more information, visit our website at www.prayerthatheals.org.
I'd like to start by asking, how do you feel your health? How do you know you're healthy? You don't feel your health. It's natural to have it. When you don't remember anything, you go out and you run and you play ball and you work and you do your garden and whatever. You don't think about, I'm healthy today. Health is not the absence of disease. So you can't say, today I'm healthy because I'm not feeling anything. Oh, you don't think that way. You just run around and do your things. Health is not a material thing. So how do we cultivate our health? You know, today health has become something that you have to get, you have to obtain, you have to cultivate, and you have to buy it. Have you heard of that? The more money you have, the more health you can buy. It doesn't work that way. When you talk about health plans, the subject of the conversation is how much does it cost and how much can you get on a certain plan. It has nothing to do with how you feel or any indications of health or lack of it. So let's go to what health really is and how can we cultivate it. Very often I get a question, which I'm sure that those of you who have been Christian Scientists for a long time have heard this question. How can a religion be a science? That's a contradiction of terms. Have you heard that question? How can it be science and religion at the same time? Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. You know, people think that religion is based on doctrines that you have to believe in and that you have to abide by certain things that you believe and you're supposed to accept, and you have to take it. And you accept it without questioning. So those people who question how can you take care of your health without paying attention at the physical condition, they say, you don't take care of your health, you're neglecting your health because you're not checking it, you're not monitoring it, and you're not taking care, you're at risk. That's not exactly the case. You are perfectly safe when you cultivate the right idea that health is a spiritual reality. You don't neglect it. So how do I know that? Because I study what Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, taught us. We'll talk more about her, but Mary Baker Eddy was deeply anchored on the Bible. So is Christian Science. And the Bible is not an old doctrinary book that today is old-fashioned. We don't need it anymore. We're ahead. We're in the science age. All those doctrines, all those things you have to believe in, that's old, that's passé. We're in another era. Have you heard that? Well, that's pretty intellectual, and it leaves a lot out of the question, which doesn't deserve to be left outside of the equation. Today, you feel that having physical fitness needs to be physically cultivated. You've got to do so many miles a day of running, of walking, or so many laps, or so many, I don't know what. You've got to measure what you can do physically in order to preserve your health. Actually, there's nothing wrong with doing sports, with running, with enjoying being outside, with swimming. It's wonderful. I think it's something we should enjoy for fun, for the joy of it, but not in order to accomplish so many miles, so many, I don't know what, in order to preserve your health. That's where the confusion is. I once heard on a TV interview, an actress had moved from New York to California, and I don't remember her name, a very young woman, very beautiful. And she said to the interviewer, actually, you know, when you move to California, the first thing you have to get is a gym. That's more important than getting an apartment. Well, you know, those people who, in antiquity, and I'm talking about 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago, all through history, there have been people who didn't know the Bible. The Bible has always, from Hebrew times, taught about one infinite God that is not materially represented. God is not a statue. God is not artwork. God is not physical. God is infinite. God is present. God is spirit. That comes from the Hebrew culture of 5,000 years ago. Throughout that, and then into Christianity, which teaches the same thing. Virtually everybody agrees that God is everywhere. How can he be confined to a physical representation? He's all over, infinite, right here. You agree with that, right? Well, people in antiquity who didn't know the Bible, there's a name for them. What were they? They didn't know that there's only one infinite God. They were pagans. That's the historic name for ancient people who didn't know that God is one infinite presence. They worshipped the beauty of the physical body. They respected a perfect physical body, and the perfect physical body was needed for people to exist in life. And the perfect physical body was required for people who were in a position of government. Kings, pharaohs, Caesars were gods, and they have to be physically beautiful. So the cultivation of the beauty of the physical body has a pagan history, when it was not important to know if there is a principle that governs the universe, which is what we call God. It was important that some figure with a name that was a beautiful, healthy, aesthetically wonderful person with a lovely physical body, that was the king. And that king was sometimes adored as God. Do you know a little bit of Bible history and you recognize that? Okay, are we allowing that influence to steal into our culture today? The Romans had the Roman baths and places where the nobility or the principal people, the nobility, went to bathe and to cultivate their physical body. Are we allowing that to influence our culture to the point of saying that it's important to have a gym more than an apartment? Where are we? What's happening? What's happening to our thought to be intellectualized to think we don't need God, but we need a gym? I don't think so. But anyway, those were pagan idolaters. So, does the Bible say anything to the opposite? Of course, all over the Bible, there is constant examples of how to cultivate your well-being through understanding God. And God is not an image, whether it's a pagan image or a today image. God is the principle that governs the universe. The Bible says that God is love. The Bible says that God is spirit. The discoverer of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, used principle, spirit, love, as words that define love, that define God. So we are in times where we can learn the opposite of pagan idolatry. And the Bible has examples. You know, there is a word, I'd like to bring it up to you. You know the word maintain, you know what it means. You know where it comes from? Anybody here learned Latin? Okay, but I'm not going to give you a Latin lesson, but I'll tell you about the word maintain. In Latin, the word hand is manu. Manu is this. And in Latin, the word tenere means to hold. So you have the verb to maintain. It comes from hold in the hand. To maintain means to hold it firmly. Well, God maintains us, doesn't he? That doesn't mean in his hands, because God is not a physical being. But the idea of maintaining is in the Bible, and it was used by the psalmist when he wrote, the Lord is the portion of mine inheritance and of my cup. Thou maintainest my lot. Lot here doesn't mean luck, or the lot where my house is. It means everything about me is maintained by God. I think that's a lovely thought to entertain, particularly when you see that there is a passage in the book written by Mary Baker Eddy, Science and Health with a Key to the Scripture, which is the basic textbook of Christian Science. In this book, Science and Health, we find this sentence: the divine mind that made man maintains his image and likeness, maintains his own image and likeness. Well, the Bible also says that man was made in the image and likeness of God. That means that God maintains man. Isn't that a powerful thought for health maintenance? It needs some exercise, but it's thinking. It's keeping that in thought, not in order to look for the presence or the absence of health, but for the fun of it, for the peace it brings, for the joy of entertaining those thoughts. And I'll tell you how it is important to have our thoughts transformed by those ideas. I'd like to explore 3 words: law, cause, and substance, and how this infinite principle that governs the universe, which is love, which is spirit, is the only cause, the only law, and the only substance in the whole universe. That kind of thinking helps us to maintain our health. We need to do that kind of exercise all the time. I'll tell you an example. You know, when I got married, my husband had been in Christian Science a very short time. And he told me how he and his mother had come into Christian Science. After his dad passed on, a few years later, his mother was in a terrible state of despondency, depression, sadness. She had absolutely no interest in anything or any life. She just wanted to give up. That lasted for a couple of years until she became very ill. She had a terminal disease, and the doctor said that she would have only a few months to live. Well, that was pretty crushing, but she didn't care because she was tired. Nothing was interesting to her. She had a friend who gave her this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She said, read this book. It'll do you a lot of good. So she began to read it. She didn't know anything about it, and she read it and read it and read it. And during 3 months, she read the whole book. And gradually, as she was reading, she began to feel stronger, and she began to feel better and to have more interest in life. Because she was beginning to see that the law that governed her was not the laws of health, failing health or good health, but it was the law of God. She realized that God was the cause of everything and the substance of everything in the universe. The substance of her own being was God's presence. As these thoughts came to her, she didn't understand all of it, but they had an effect in her life, and she found herself healed. She found herself well. The very doctor that had said that she couldn't live more than 3 months was very surprised, and he didn't want to admit it, but suddenly he had to say, "You are completely restored. You can get on with your life normally." Well, she had a young son, a young adult, who was in his mid-20s. He saw what happened to his mother. He witnessed it. Gradually, he saw her interest come back and her health come back. So he became curious and interested. He began to read Science and Health. But he also found out that he had to read the Bible. He had never read the Bible in his life. He knew it existed. They had one in the house. He respected it. Beautiful, but he had never touched it. So he became a Bible student and a student of Science and Health. In a few years, he was a deep student of Christian Science. Well, before getting to what happened to this young man, I'll tell you what happened to this lady who later became my mother-in-law, because I married him. When she was restored to health and she felt so beautifully comfortable and happy and all that, the friend who had given her the book invited her to go to a Christian Science church. No way, she wasn't going to go to a church she didn't know. She thought it could be dangerous, it could be mysterious, something occult. She said, "No way, I'm not going to go, I'm afraid." She was literally afraid, and she said it openly. "I don't go to a place that I don't know what it is." But that wasn't enough, because she knew that reading the book published by that church, she was restored to health. So she didn't want to go, but she didn't want to dismiss it either. So she asked 2 very reliable friends of her late husband to go there and check it out, make sure it was something clean and safe. So they went. And they came back saying, "There's nothing spooky about it. There's nothing mysterious. They have a lovely service on Sunday morning that consists of readings from the Bible and from this book that you read. They sang beautiful songs. We prayed together the Lord's Prayer. We prayed in silence. That's what I saw, and they were so kind with us. They were so loving. You can go there. There's absolutely no danger, nothing funny about it." So the following Sunday, she went with them. She sat between the 2 of them just in case. And she realized that this was not a cult, which was something she was afraid of. There was nobody preaching, nobody telling her what to do, nobody asking her for anything, for money or for doctrine or anything. She also realized it wasn't a sect, which were the things she was afraid of. It wasn't any of that. It was a nice Christian church presenting a religion which she had read and had restored her. She began to go, and eventually she became a Christian Scientist and lived 25 more years, very healthy and a very useful life. And of course, her son became a devoted student of Christian Science. The history that we see in the Bible, to me, is the history of human thought evolving in its understanding of God. It's history in the making. Is the more people understand what God is, and Bible episodes show that, people mature, evolve, and become better societies as they understand God better. And the episodes, the things that we read in the Bible, which people popularly say they are miracles, they were natural things that happened because some individuals, which we call prophets, understood the laws of God. They understood what is cause. They understood the substance of the universe, and they did things which, to the non-understanding ears, was impossible, so it was miraculous. But they were natural because they knew what God is, and they knew what is cause, what is law, and what is substance. So it's important to read the Bible. It is the history of human thought as it begins to understand God's better. Of course, in the event of Christ Jesus coming, that understanding becomes clearer than ever. He was the greatest master of understanding what God is. Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, who was a devout Christian and follower of the teachings of Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ, was a very sincere, honest, devoted student of the Bible since she was a very little girl. And studying the Bible was the most important thing in her life. The Bible was the authority for her, even as a child. They belonged to a Protestant church, she and her family, and she respected the family. She wanted to belong to the church of her parents. She wanted to follow the teachings. She respected it. But it came to a point where she saw what the Bible presented, and she read in the Bible only confirmations that God is love. More and more, the more she studied, even as a little girl, she found love in the Bible. She found solutions in the Bible. She found healing in the Bible. So she could not agree with a teaching which she was receiving through the doctrine of her church that God punishes, and punishes some people and condemns others. It just didn't make sense to her, and she could not accept something she didn't understand. There is a logic in the Bible, and she found that logic in the Bible. So whatever didn't obey that biblical logic of understanding God as the principle that governs the universe, and not a big old man giving orders, the more she saw that principle to be love, the less she could agree with the teachings that she had to conform to suffering, that God sends suffering, and that some people are condemned and others are blessed forever. It didn't make sense, and she couldn't reconcile those things. When she was a teenager, she wanted to join the church of her parents, very honestly. Of course, when you join the church, you have at some point to say that you agree with the teachings, to agree with the doctrine. And she had to say that at a meeting when she was interviewed for membership, for being accepted as member. And she couldn't say that she agreed with it. So the pastor who was interviewing her asked the question, "Did you agree with our doctrine?" And she said no. She said she could not admit that God condemned a few people and blessed others, and that she wanted to join the church. She wanted to belong to the church of her parents, and she wanted to be admitted and accepted. But she could not say she agreed because she was honest. The pastor was sensitive enough to notice that her honesty and her spiritual devotion was so pure, so complete, that he could not refuse her into the membership. And she was accepted, although accepted with a but I don't agree with that. She was so good, so obedient, that she stayed in that church for 37 years. Well, during her life, she had many episodes and many situations in which she kept studying the Bible. She kept looking for solace and relief from suffering. She was not physically healthy herself, so she was constantly looking for solutions for improvement in health and relief of human suffering in all aspects. So she studied many things that were available, to which today we would describe as alternate medicine. Whatever was the fashion in the middle of the 19th century, which is when she spent most of her life in the 19th century, she studied those things in the hope of finding relief from, finding something that would alleviate human suffering. She found it gave her that, but temporarily. It wasn't a final answer. It didn't give her the logic that she was looking for, which she found in the Bible. And whenever she looked at these so-called spiritual teachings, in Europe they say esoteric teachings, she looked for them, and she didn't find God in them, and that was enough for her to not go there. Until one day when she suffered an accident, and this story is very well known. She had spinal injuries, and she was told she wouldn't walk again, probably. In an agonizing moment when she felt that she was between life and death, it was told later that she was not between life and death, but that's how she felt. She read an episode of healing in the Bible, and during healing that Jesus performed, during the reading of that brief description of how Jesus healed a man, she had such a feeling of the spiritual reality of God's presence. It was so palpable. That substance of God's presence was so concrete to her, spiritually concrete. The cause that God is of all life was spiritually concrete to her. She realized that there were laws that govern the universe, and that law is God. It's not a human law. In a split moment of realizing that, her health was restored. She got up and she walked. She was 44 years old, and she devoted the next 45 years of her life to giving what she had discovered to mankind. There's plenty of healing. There are hundreds of healings that happened through her, through those who studied with her, through those who read what she wrote. Some time ago, I was giving a lecture like this last month in Europe. And after the lecture, somebody asked me, what's the difference between Mary Baker Eddy and other people today that heal spiritually? There are plenty. And it's true. Christian Science doesn't claim ownership of spiritual healing. Others heal too, but Christian Science is an educational process of spiritual understanding. And I found myself, when somebody says to you, students of this and that and other masters in the East, some very famous, Buddha and Confucius, and others who received spiritual teaching or gave spiritual teaching very similar to Jesus. You can't deny that. And today there are churches out there healing spiritually. You can't deny that. So who's Mary Baker Eddy? What's the difference? When she had her healing, she could have gone on with her life very happily. She was restored to health. She understood how. But she didn't put a period there. She devoted the rest of her life to understanding better what had happened to her, what had cut her off from all the studies she had done before and put her on a path of finding a way of healing and leaving it documented and in a way that it can be taught, it can be learned today, 100 and something years after this happened. So there is a huge difference. She established a system and left a system of spiritual education, which ultimates in healing, available to mankind today. So that's different from so many other people who create little groups of healing, and then 10 years later it passed and there's another one, or they leave a book, but it doesn't have the structure, the organization that Mary Baker Eddy felt as a revelation. She didn't crank it up. She needed to articulate for mankind what she had understood, and she spent her life doing that. So it's different. She devoted her life so that mankind could understand what had healed her. In doing that, she came to found her own church. That moment of healing was the moment in which she discovered the science of Christianity, which Jesus knew. What Jesus knew was a science. And she discovered it, she identified it as something that can be learned and practiced today, and established it in an organization, a church. She wrote 16 books. She made it available to mankind, and she was inspired to do that as each step followed the other. She did not invent it. It came to her gradually. That puts her in a very different position than many other people who did spiritual healing and still do. There is no question about that. One of the things I like to see as different is, do you know what it means to be gullible? That's not scientific, right? To be gullible is not scientific. To believe alone is not scientific either. To have faith in something, it's very good, but it's not scientific either. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a rabbi in Brazil, and he teaches theology. And in one of his lectures, he said, and he's totally engulfed in it, and he is going to have a degree in theology and whatnot. He's a very important guy. He said, theology is never scientific. And he's a theologian of the Jewish faith. He said, theology cannot be scientific because theology is based on belief. It's believing that makes theology. And I thought, well, Christian Science is beyond that. It's not merely believing, we have to understand. Believing alone is not enough. Neither gullibility nor credulity can make it. It's understanding, what is it? What is God? What is man? And that clearly explained or clearly seen restores health. It restores the harmony of God. It's not a matter of restoring health or curing a certain disease. It restores the harmony of man, which is more than health. There are so many areas in our lives when we need harmony. And it may not be a physical problem, a physical disease. What I love about what Mary Baker Eddy discovered and how she teaches it is that feeling of love, of God's love coming to human thought with comfort, with solace, with peace, and with healing. Talking about it I think in a respectful and moving way about her own journey in the direction of establishing Christian Science. She says, the author, and she's writing, the author, she's referring to herself. She says, the author became a member of the Orthodox Congregational Church in early years. That's the church to which she belonged 37 years. Later, she learned that her own prayers failed to heal her, as did the prayers of her devout parents and the church. But when the spiritual sense of the creed was discerned in the science of Christianity, this spiritual sense was a present help. It was the living, palpitating presence of Christ, truth, which healed the sick. That's on page 351 of Science and Health. I think it tells so clearly the difference between the creed and getting a spiritual sense of the truth, which was a present help. And that's not present in her time. It's present today. She writes it with italics. So it is important to feel that palpitating presence. And You know, it has a lot to do with what Jesus said when he said, I shall not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. That palpitating presence isn't gone. It wasn't particularly to Mary Baker Eddy or to Jesus. He said, I will not leave you comfortless. In Christian Science, we learn to understand. It's a step beyond merely believing. In order to understand, we cannot go on the information of research. Research always produces data, and that's what the sciences, and I'm using sciences in the plural, the human sciences evolve. They produce research, they do research over and over and over again throughout the centuries, and the research produces data. And the data yielded today makes the data of 10 years ago old, obsolete, superseded. So it's constantly, and in the science, in the scientific language, you will hear people saying, today we know that this has been discovered, and so whatever was before was no longer valid. And it's constantly producing more and more advanced information and data, right? Well, that's interesting. A science is not made of accumulated data, because the data get obsolete. So you accumulate data and you find another step, well, the previous one is no longer valid. So science, real science, cannot be accumulated data. Actually, when you look at thousands of years ago, Jesus knew, and some prophets, they knew the law of God already. They were healing with that law before all this accumulated data. Because the law of God is not found through human research or any kind of research. It unfolds itself. I like the word unfold because it means to take the fold which covers it. Take away the fold and you see what's there. Discover is take away the cover. Reveals take away the veil. Unveil is taking away the veil. These words are all very related to each other. Christian Science is a revelation. Bible is a revelation. It's the removing of what covers to see what is. So the law of God, the law that governs the universe, unfolds itself. It reveals itself, and it was known 2,000, 5,000 years ago. And it's constantly unfolding itself because God is love. The very nature of love, everybody will agree with that, is giving. The very nature of God is to reveal itself. Love doesn't hide. Love isn't shy. Love doesn't move away. Love is constantly revealing itself. God wants to be known. Its unfoldment is going on all the time. So the platform of thinking in Christian Science begins with love revealing its own reality instead of researching to get to a scientific datum that tomorrow will be found to be different. So it's not a matter of asking God to heal disease. God doesn't come to disease and heal it. Sometimes people ask, does Christian Science heal this? Does Christian Science heal that? Have you heard that? That's not the way it works. The unfoldment, the ever revealing himself of God as love, when it is discerned, it makes the inharmony vanish because the reality is God's presence. So that's what heals. It's not asking God to do something. He didn't do anything wrong. Everything he did is perfect. We need to acknowledge that. So it's in God's presence, inharmony vanishes because it isn't real, and God is real. God as the principle that governs the universe. God as the love that manifests itself non-stop because of its very nature. So, Jesus knew that, and he said to his own students, "The works that I do shall ye do also." He commanded those who understood him to do what he did. And greater works, he said, and greater works than these, because I go to my Father. Where was he going? He was going where he came from to his Father. In saying that, he told his students forever, and his students are not only those in his time, those who study his teachings all the way to today. He told them they could do the works that he did because he was going back to his Father. In stating that, he was saying he had a Father who was God. He never said he was God. So it's so clear when we begin to discern in the science of Christianity, with spiritual sense, we begin to see the science, we begin to understand, and that's more than believing. It takes a little bit of trust. It takes that disposition to change the platform of your thought and start from the reality of God's presence. That's what maintains our health. Talking about unfoldment, I'd like to tell the story of a friend of mine who once worked with this word unfoldment and had a beautiful healing. She's a nurse, a Christian Science nurse, which means her occupation requires taking care of a patient the whole day and standing up. And once she was on a case, and she had to stand up the whole day, she didn't have a moment to pause. And during that period, she began to develop a tremendous pain in one of her heels. She was very afraid. And the pain was insisting, it was coming up her leg, and she was working on this case, she couldn't let go. So she called a Christian Science practitioner, who is somebody who helps others through prayer in Christian Science, and asked for help. The practitioner didn't say, "God will heal your heel." It's difficult to say that. The practitioner said, "Look up what Mrs. Eddy says in Science and Health about unfoldment." And this is what she found. Christian Science presents unfoldment, not accretion. Accretion means accumulation. It manifests no material growth from molecule to mind, but an impartation of the divine mind to man and the universe. I think it's so tender to think that Christian Science is an impartation of the divine mind to man and the universe. An impartation of the divine mind. So the practitioner told her to see that impartation of God to man brings harmony to the front. It doesn't take away inharmony. It brings reality to light, to the forefront of thought and to visibility. She worked with those ideas for 2 or 3 days after being in pain for 2 weeks. And suddenly she realized the pain was subsiding, and in a couple of days it disappeared, and she never suffered from that again. That was several years ago, at least 10 years. But she worked with the word unfoldment. And I think that makes such a difference to know what unfoldment is. God unfolds. God is revealing himself. Recently in the study of sciences, I think it's in physics, people are saying that the universe is constantly expanding. The way I think we can look at it from the standpoint of unfolding, it's more and more of the universe is becoming possible for us to be aware of. It's there, it was there before. The universe isn't growing. It is infinite, but we are beginning to see more of it as we begin to see the law that governs it, which is not physical. That's not an accumulation of tradition. This is one of the things that my husband and his mother discovered when they went to that church, that this was a scientific knowledge, and science is not an accumulation of inherited traditions. It's not an accumulation of knowledge, it's an unfoldment, it's discovery of God. And that's going on all the time. You know, in Jesus' time, year one of the Christian era, there was tremendous resistance and opposition to him. Everything that could possibly be done to stop him was done, to the point that they even killed him. Well, that wasn't enough to stop him. He knew enough about God, and he resuscitated himself. That opposition to Jesus and to the spiritual interpretation of the universe which he gave, through which so many people were healed by him, that bringing to light the opposite of what Rome, the foreign power which was occupying his country, wanted to stop him, because they wanted to hold on to power, control, prestige. They were dominating, occupying the country unfairly. People were paying taxes and being enslaved and whatnot. You know the story. What Jesus was teaching threatened all that. So the authorities of the Roman government resisted it. Among those things was the cultivation of the physical body and the adoration of Caesar as God. Here again, in the Roman resistance against Jesus' teaching, we find the Roman baths and the physical culture as a very important part of the culture and of life and of hierarchy. Are we allowing that to come up to our society again? Are we finding it pretty? Are we going along with it? It's a question. Well, that opposition, which would have liked to stop Jesus and didn't, presents itself again before the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy, because her teachings will stop the advancement of the cultivation of physicality on its heel, on its start. It presents a way of finding health through the way we think, through the way we act, through the way we feel, and not through how many laps or how many miles we run. Jesus knew that there was opposition against him, and he knew it was going to try to stop him, to silence his voice. But he said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." Have they passed away? Everybody talks about Jesus, whether they like him or believe in him or not. The substance of what he said was substantial, so much so that it never disappeared. And we're saying that today, not only we in this room, out there, people mention Jesus all the time, one way or another. The substance of what he taught was so concrete that it never disappeared. Because good is God, and that's one of my favorite things to think. One thing is to say that God is good as a quality, which is true, but that's minor. Good is God. That's a different thing. Good as a noun is God. Good is an entity. Do you know what's an entity? Anybody here who doesn't? Good is an entity. Evil is not an entity. It's so easy to think that there is a devil out there doing funny things. That gives an entity to evil. And we forget that the only entity there is good. And that is God. Evil is like a verb without a subject. You know grammar? You cannot use a verb without a subject. because it doesn't have a head. It doesn't have somebody to be it, to do it. Evil is not an entity. Good is an entity. And it is revealing itself. I'm not talking about goodness. Goodness is a result of it. Kindness, loving kindness. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, good as an entity. Good is God. Mrs. Eddy defines good as God. Omni-action. The only thing that has action is good. Evil doesn't have action because it doesn't have a head, doesn't have a subject. Good is an entity, and evil is impossible in God's presence. It's not difficult to agree that God is everywhere. I've never found somebody who disagreed with that, regardless of what their belief, doctrine, or religion is. If they think there is a God, whether they believe in it or not, they know it's everywhere. Evil is not possible in God's presence. It's not that God destroys evil. Evil is not a power. There is no combat between good and evil. And the only thing that advances is good, because it's real. Good advances, love advances. Understanding God is advancement. It may meet with resistance, but the resistance doesn't attack. It recedes, it resists, and it would try to silence the voice of Mary Baker Eddy, just as it tried to silence the teachings of Jesus. But it cannot silence the voice of Mary Baker Eddy because she is voicing the truth she found in the Bible. It's that palpitating presence that she discovered, and that it's present to any of us now or tomorrow. So it is important to cultivate that new platform of thought from which we're not looking for restoration of health. We're looking for a complete acknowledgement, a complete awareness of that infinity, that allness, which is the principle that governs the universe, which cannot be perceived materially, but it is perceived in the heart, and that is irresistible. It's not at war. It's coming along. So we need to cultivate the science of understanding God. And in order to do that, we need to go on a diet. Jesus prescribed a diet to his followers. Do you know it? Some of you do. Everybody does. He said, "There is nothing from without a man that entering him can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man." So here we are counting calories, counting sugar, counting fat, and counting certain things out and numbering. No, let's do the other diet. It's what we think and what we say. That defiles a man. Jesus did prescribe a diet. It's very different than the diet people are looking for today, together with the fitness club. In some places, a fitness club is called a health club. Have you seen that? Is it? I don't think so, based on what we said today. Health is cultivated through understanding the unfoldment, the revelation, the self-giving that comes from this infinite love which is God, for whom there is no opposition. Evil recedes in God's presence. It disappears in God's presence when we base our thought, when we acknowledge, when we are aware of that infinite presence. We need to decide to go that way. It's not on autopilot. We need to decide to look in that direction and look for that feeling. The Bible is full of it. Science and health is full of it. So we need to cultivate that understanding. It's not a matter of cultivating the physical fitness of the body, but cultivate how we think about it, how we think about who we are. The spiritual image and likeness of God is not a physical man. It is God's idea constantly revealing itself. That's what man is. Man is not a physical being. And it's not a genetic being. It's not a DNA being. Man is the idea of God, and the idea of God is constantly manifesting itself, and as we begin to accept and see it, we find it. It's findable, and it's not in matter. But we find it in an improved life in the human picture. Knowing the reality of God improves the human condition. It does not perfect the human being, but it improves the human condition. Communion with God is the law that destroys the apparent reality of evil. And that's what I invite you to do. Take communion with God. And I don't mean a ritual or a church ceremony. It's communion is to commune, to be at one with, to be thinking of. Communion with God is the law that destroys the apparent reality of evil. So I invite you to cultivate your thought, to have that communion all the time. Pray that way all the time. You know, sometimes I ask, what did Jesus pray for when he went up on the mountain? Do you know? I don't think he prayed for this and that and the other. He communed with God. And his communion, his being at one with God, his awareness of God's allness, blessed all mankind and improved the earth, improved the human condition. He told us to do that. So join me in cultivating a spiritual sense of health, because health is a spiritual reality. Thank you for joining me.
For more information on Christian Science healing, visit www.prayerthatheals.org. The live lecture you've been watching is a gift to this community from the Christian Science churches and reading rooms in Southern California. To learn more about how prayer can heal, you're welcome to visit our church services on Sundays and Wednesdays. Weekly Bible lessons and documented testimonials of healing are available at all Christian Science reading rooms. For times of services, locations, or to watch other lectures, visit www.prayerthatheals.org.